Well, thanks for coming back from lunch. I feel like I don't need to say anything because Crystal acquainted us all with each other's work yesterday. But I will come out as the queer educator who's interested in sort of the intersections of literacies and digital rhetoric. So I will start there.
During a mid-semester break in the spring of 2014, Ben, a youth participant and co-researcher, and I sat down at City Town's neighborhood cafe to discuss his sponsors of language and literacy. During the interview, I invited Ben to draw Sponsorscape's map, detailing the institutions, tools, people, and other sponsors that influence his own understanding and identity as a reader and writer. As a language and literacy educator who has particular interest in digital literacies and writing in digital environments, I was curious to see what techno tools made the map. Moreover, I was attentive to Ben detailing his sponsors, as I was quite aware that the writing and composing Ben shared with me was just one facet of a much larger ecology and network of literacy. Borrowing from Brandt, I view sponsors as any agents, local or distant, concrete or abstract, who enable, support, teach, model, as well as recruit, regulate, suppress, or withhold literacy. Sponsors, nevertheless, set the terms for access to literacy and wield powerful incentives for compliance and loyalty. I share this quote with you to help explain that sponsors are not just people, but could be larger institutions, tools, etc. Literacy sponsorscapes, in the spirit of both the Potterized Scapes metaphor and brand sponsorship construct, was a way for us to account for the various literacy sightings participants accounted for in interviews. The scape suffix, an additive placeholder for fluid and multiple realities of recomposing, accounts for the dynamic processes of multimodal writing in the collapse of space-time. Literacy sponsorscapes center the cultural capacity of digital composing as you create, curate, and compose laminations of self through sedimented identity texts across scale. The Sponsorscapes map not only highlights chasms between conceptions of contemporary language and literacy learning, but it echoes the tensions of literacy and composition in an era of techno-inclusions. How, in a world comprised of both human and non-human actors, do we account for the traces of techno-literacies and digital rhetoric? What might these traces teach us about methodology and the digital humanities? How can these resonances of these literacies be rendered as facets of digital rhetoric?
So as I cycle back a year later and revisit the Sponsorscapes map and emergent data from Ben's Think Aloud session, reflecting on the 30 months of connective ethnographic fieldwork I completed in working to describe and explore how LGBT and queer youth orchestrate identity, engage civically, and build and sustain community through writing with mobile media, I'm reminded of Pierce Durst's recent blog essay on inventing the digital humanities through Freudian praxis. In it, Durst uses the metaphor of origami and the particulars of folding and unfolding the paper crane to nuance the rhetorical processes and practices of building and deconstructing in the humanities classroom. For Durst, this recursive practice is a bright spot in the advancement and ongoing invention of what is being called the digital humanities. Using Durst's metaphor of foldings, I'll work to meditate on the particulars of digital rhetorics and the dialogic conceptualization of the digital humanities. This presentation is what some would call the building place between method and storying. It's an attempt to put forth a yes and theory of contemporary everyday literacy sightings in digital rhetoric. First, heuristically, I examine the foldings and unfoldings of theory and present a possible reimagining of digital literacies and techno-composition. After, I'll examine key examples from my own research that illustrate possibilities and conundrums for tracing these resonances and shed light on what may be missing from the building, deconstruction, and folding/unfolding paradigms. Ultimately, I'll ask if the metaphor and materiality of foldings help explain the dynamic and shifting relations between techno-composition, digital culture, and the humanities. While the techno-centered question has been taken up by an array of scholars documenting the cyborg/metal meets flesh era of writing in the age of the internet, I want to attend to and be cognizant of Camille's opening reflection that you saw highlighted in the opening video. Young people still do make meaning through the composition of their texts. And while I think it's necessary to move beyond the modernist and structuralist backslides of empirical meaning making and so-called truth, I also think it important to recognize and validate the small moments of agency youth feel when composing a diary-like blog post, or retweeting a follower from the Black Lives Matter movement in Lansing to join a larger cacophony of youth resistance. Although these granular utterances are what some would call a speck of sand on a much larger beach of networked geographies, they help, as Massey contends, attend to the ongoing stories and folds of the everyday, even perhaps on varying planes of imminence. Elastic literacies, a heuristic perspective that helps account for literacy sponsorscapes, is a quasi-scavenger theory, or as Halberstam would contend, a queer methodology insofar as it operates from seemingly incommensurable vantage points to nuance and understand text, context, spatiality, and representation. It works to trace resonance in meaning as we come to exist in a textured world. Through voicing two youth stories and attending to the unfoldings of their digital practice, I'll perform a genealogy of the varying turns made by these young people as they trace tensions between digital representation and materiality. Through the storying episodes, I hope to render how elastic literacies, the foldings of theory, operates both by focusing on identity work and contextual meaning making, but also by understanding affect and the politics of spatiality against a non-representational backdrop, tenets often discounted in the digital humanities. In the end, I'll be a voice in the larger weekend to meditate on what youth may teach us about digital rhetoric. I'll speak to the role literacy sponsorscapes played in the analysis of data and highlight my use of these digital spaces to queer methodology. As youth curated and created identities through composing, identities came to fruition through the textual landscapes of digital environments and literacy sponsorscapes saturated with cultural rhetoric. Elastic literacies helps crystallize and bring to fruition how Asano Francini contends cultural values about bodies are articulated and negotiated, realigned through the foldings of digital rhetorics and the digital humanities. Apart from text-based posts that youth composed across digital environments, the ontological act of being and composing the self was illustrated through bodily inscription and alternative forms of embodied visuality. Halfway into the first year of the larger connective ethnography, Jack, an 18-year-old transmasculine and genderqueer youth, transitioned and had top surgery. His word, not my own. Months after, Jack and I sat down to begin mining his blog for pieces of writing he felt were important representations of his literacy identity. When we met, Jack presented images that he took and published to Tumblr in the form of photo posts. When asked about the documented stream, he responded, "With Tumblr, it's okay for things that are not finished. Things and pictures are in constant movement. It's always being reblogged and liked and whatnot. It's not a permanent thing. I want people my age to see that there's an identity beyond the physical body. We're always unfinished. Plus, it's like a collage of man and machine. That's cool, right?" Rather than include these posts as independent visual utterances, I want to highlight here the connective reads live streaming provides for youth curators to consider aspects of voice and audience. Live streaming is a seemingly mundane practice. The ongoing sharing of personal information to a networked audience, live streaming is the creation of a digital portrait of one's actions and thoughts. Over a period of 3 days on Tumblr, July 9th through July 11th, 2013, Jack live streamed over 250 posts. The progression is interesting to slow down if we consider how this live stream could be read as impetus for his own subjectivity as genderqueer trans youth. The partial live stream Jack and I captured from his Tumblr archive originates with a reblog photo post of a pick-stitch collage of Tony Stark, the quasi-human merge of man and metal protagonist from the 2011 film Iron Man 2. Following the picture is a personal photo-based selfie. The descriptor text for the photo reads, "Topless Tuesday. Wow, this is exciting. The internet now has pictures of me shirtless. Yippee. For a non-sorry for bad quality photo, I appear to have misplaced my camera." It's then tagged with, "My scars are looking nice already," and "Life with the Jack." The post was used as a way to archive, again, his word, not my own, his transition on Tumblr. Noted by Jack as one of the site's best features, Tumblr's archive function provided him, as well as other participants, with an indexical and positional account of the emotions he had in writing the temporal self. Following the topless selfie, Jack reblogs numerous posts that index and position him both as a viewer and consumer of BBC's Orphan Black, as an avid fanatic and member of the youth fandom life and pop culture, followed by a reblog of a jolting close-up of eye and iris. Bookended in this partial live stream is another photo-based selfie that Jack constructs. In a post entitled "Welcome to the Trip, Orphan Jack," Jack uses still photography to capture 4 images of himself costumed as unique clones. Jack constructed a gender variant version of the show with his photo post featuring 4 male Jack clones. He also spoke to the larger indexed identities and community positions he curated in reblogging and tagging photos that surveyed pop culture series such as Iron Man and Orphan Black. Live streaming and curating positional selves can be read here as a rhetorical movement, binding youth to the varying positions and identities, both ethnographically, local, but also virtually, they render visible. Refracted through Jack's partial live stream and composing process, we can begin to see how, as Robert Yagelski notes, the writing does not create us, but in the act of writing we are. By writing, we affirm and proclaim our being in the here and now. Through design and the creation of artifactual technoliteracies, we begin to see how youth employ composing in digital environments to compose the self. The act, not only procedural and product-oriented, evokes an emotion that truly shifts the type of self we write and curate. In fact, this event, part of a larger literacy sponsorscape of a trans teen tumbling, could be read as an ontological process, a sensory and emotive act of healing the selves through the imaginings of connective identity texts. If we abstract away from Ben's larger sponsorscapes map that you saw in the opening video, and instead focus on the process and rationale for using mobile media, such as Snapchat, to architect experience, we begin to see how he uses the digital tool to map and render visible affect. In this section, I story an episode of data collection where instead of tracing resonances of literacy's work, I interrogated what is emergent in this data. Unlike many of the other youth users with whom I participated with and observed in their Snapchat use in composing, Ben was an outlier. He felt he needed to map the snapping process as it both captured the amount of time he spent curating the experience as well as the distance he traversed to create it. Because Ben was the sole participant whose interest in mapping his narrative led him to visually and digitally track it, I worked to better understand the particulars of the Snap story's trajectory and situation. Why did he need to tell these so-called spatial stories? Using the Map My Walk app, a parallel application he had running throughout the creation of his Snap story, using it as a mentor text, Ben and I used Google Earth to stitch and track the narrative he took. We then used the Google Earth maps to highlight the layered spatial stories that occurred across space-time traversals. For Ben, Snapchat allowed him to curate his, quote, collective life and document his consciousness. Plotting, tracing, and stitching together, let me play this video. The overarching narratives and spatial stories that took place across Ben's Snap story allowed us for us to have an in-depth discussion while making of why Snapchat was the tool of primacy for Ben. As we used Google Earth to map the various folds of narrative embedded within the longer Snap story, Ben elaborated on his composing process. Why is Snapchat your primary mode for writing? I like it. It's extremely informal. People are more likely to respond because you can't just get the pop-up and see what it is and ignore it. You have to open it. You have to hold it down. You don't read it, you see. I will know if you read it. I like that. Honestly, it's the informality that makes it easier to do a lot more things. Rather than text messaging or microblogging across venues of social media, Ben prefers Snapchat given its focus on the ephemeral and visual. This visual turn could be seen as indicative of what Veroff remarks as a spatio-visual or navigational turn, insofar as its larger lineage has been traced across the visual and spatial, which then evolved into a piqued interest and emphasis on mobility. Snapping for Ben, like live streaming for Jack, is about curating an experience, collecting moments through visual frames to tell a moment or perhaps to experience a rememory. When asked what the affordances of composing with Snapchat were, Ben replied, "It's like being with someone for that day. It's very intimate. When you see that snap, only a small group can see that snap. I get to feel like I am with them. People who I don't care about, who I don't want to share that moment with, they don't get to know. It's a memory for a small collective, an experience we have together." Snapchat, through its array of Snap selfies, screenshots, and visual ecologies, is a storied assessment of experience. The array of spatial stories Ben tells in this particular Snap story are effectively charged, propelling him to document certain experiences over others. In a 24-frame narrative arc, Ben snaps a story that traces the histories of both the geographic and physical location of his elementary school and of the particulars of the moment he wants to share. Ben commences the narrative by opening with a horizontal turned vertical frame with text overlaying his elementary school. This, both visually and textually, sets the audience to be a receiver of going back in time with Ben. As a narrative time traveler, Ben continues this thread by then streaming several frames that document the highlighted blank space of a history he can no longer represent. For example, in frame 3, Ben highlights an area just adjacent to his head where he uses Snap's paint feature to highlight the area where his previous love interest laid his head. By drawing the audience into landscapes of times past, Ben provides a scenario that is affectively charged. The first spatial story then continues with Ben traversing the playground to sit on the swings. In frame 5, we see a still action frame of a 10-second video where Ben records himself swinging. Backdropped by the squeaking of the swing's chain and the rush of wind on the autumn day, Ben propels his audience to feel his own navigation across space-time. Closing out this first snap story is a still photo frame of a painted United States map with Michigan hollowed out. Using the text feature, he types, "Why is my state hollowed out?" He closes his first spatial story, perhaps unnoticingly, by indexing his location both physically with the hollowed map and text indexing him as a Michigan resident, but also temporally, as he asks viewers to go back in time with him. As a narrative time traveler and spatial storyteller, Ben's larger goal as a composer is to, as he says, create art. As we stitch together frames of his overlapping spatial stories, Ben discusses his own strategies of being a snap artist. It's like art. I know of one example. When I was in San Diego, I saw these artists and they do these giant sand sculptures with various colors of sand. It's intricate, it's beautiful. They are masterpieces, every single one. Then, just like that, they let the wind blow it away. That is what is so beautiful about Snapchat. It's so temporary. Curating and stitching together frames to compose an embodied experience for Ben is like art. Composing with Snapchat, however, like Ben contends, is ephemeral. Often these narrative cartographers are like the sand he cites, blown not by the wind, but by the effective intensities that incite coinciding spatial stories to be taken up, composed, and queerly felt. So as Jack and Ben's stories and unfoldings illuminate, the building or deconstruction dualism is but one paradigm in understanding the constitutive parts of digital rhetoric. Jack, the live streaming archivist, and Ben, the temporal storyteller and narrative cartographer, allow us to see how seemingly mundane and everyday digital literacy practices with mobile media may inform the work we all do in writing and rhetorical analyses. For those of us in literacy studies and education in particular, they help inform how the paradigm of K-12 tech integration may not be a one-size-fits-all approach. As I sit in classroom spaces that don the pseudonym of the digital humanities classroom for charter school dollars, and see students have to disconnect from local knowledges, literally putting cell phones, tablets, and PSPs in over-the-door shoe organizers to strap into capitalist rhetoric of Chromebooks and BYOD initiatives, I'm concerned about the way we use and talk about technology as a panacea and paradox of purchasing equity for young people. Tech is visibly available, but used in ways that devalue youth enterprise and innovation. It's like reading the 29 steps needed to make the paper crane without ever touching the paper. And as Ben and Jack highlight, the youth with whom I had the privilege to work alongside have loved to yak, yes, but they also love to hack. Prior to closing, I want to return to the origami metaphor and think about the refolding or implications for the brief talk. As we sit here gathered as a group and advocate for varying approaches and interstices of digital rhetoric, I want us to interrogate the varying dimensions of storying that are often left on the cutting room floor. The B-roll behind the large data sets, the pretty visualizations, and the computer-centric / algorithmic soft power. How do the body, the physical material, as well as the ontological, for example, come up in work concerning digital rhetoric and the digital humanities? Although I'm hopeful that scholars like Jen Sano-Francini, among others, and larger movements such as Disrupt DH will continue to center the cultural rhetorics work done at the center of the digital humanities, I think it necessary to continue to meditate on the cultural representations of embodied difference. For youth users and archivists like Jack, the digital rhetoric and DH practices of curating and collecting inform and index not only his understanding of queer self and gender difference, but takes on a collaborative and heteroglossic form of knowledge production, an often cited warrant for the work we all do. These small moments matter. Similarly, if we refold Ben's snap story and trace the effective moments he encounters through a variety of temporal traversals, two other themes become salient for us as we ponder the place of youth and young people in the building of digital rhetorics, temporality and affect. With the fleeting ephemeral archive and the effective intensities that delivered an array of push and pull narratives mediated through Ben's phone, we should consider recentering time and affect among the analytical dimensions of primacy for doing digital work. My own understanding of these themes are informed by scholars such as David Gruber, Jeff and Jenny Rice, Jody Shipka, individuals who are moving beyond the novel quantitative approaches to open text corpora and paying attention to the individual, the space, the time, and the affect. In partner to those who I just named, and in addition to those of us who came together in this space this weekend, I also find the work being done in critical geography and non-representational theory exciting, as these orientations of thought are not solely interested in the enactment and construction of representing the paper crane, but also the color of the paper, the landscape that backdrops the creation, the size of the cuticle bed on the fingers that bend, that fold, that break, that architect. In closing, I want to problematize Durst's folding, unfolding, refolding metaphor and consider how the social actor becomes the sole interlocutor to making. As I tried to do, to make and to build my own paper crane, working to understand how it felt, I couldn't help but think about the non-human enterprises that facilitated my lack of ease in making the paper bird. Was the table surface hard or soft? Was the paper from my printer or was it cardstock? Why does this take so long? How in the hell did I get a paper cut twice in the same spot? Why doesn't mine look like the picture? Engaging in this materialist and effective forms of inquiry and placing both human and non-human actors on the same plane of immanence asks us to take on alternative modes of thinking, of failing, of being, and of doing digital rhetoric's work. If, as Burke argues, rhetoric is concerned with the state of Babel after the fall, then we should surely seek to understand how our time, how our bodies, and how our fall may digitally feel. Thanks.